Alright, so today what I want to talk about is the control over skeletal muscle contraction. And as you guys are just intuitively aware, skeletal muscles are under conscious, voluntary control. Okay, we're aware of their contractions. We consciously command their contractions. Now there are exceptions to this. There are some skeletal muscles that can be controlled involuntarily, but they also can be controlled voluntarily. Okay, so skeletal muscles are under conscious, voluntary control. We can command which specific muscles we want to contract and also how hard we want those to contract. Okay, so the next question I have for you guys is how do we innervate skeletal muscles? How are these effector organs innervated? And to deal with that, we're going to have to deal with the motor division of the nervous system. And within the motor division, we have a couple different sets of neurons. We have neurons that are part of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, but what do you guys know about the autonomic nervous system? What effector organs is the autonomic nervous system going to innervate? That's cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glandular tissue. So that's not going to be involved with innervating skeletal muscles. So what that means is that motor neurons traveling through that are part of the somatic nervous system are going to come down and innervate these skeletal muscles. We're going to have commands from the central nervous system, and as the last step of integration, we decide what we want to do. We decide what effector organs we want to innervate. So after that happens, those commands are going to travel down through the somatic nervous system, and they're going to innervate skeletal muscles. Alright, so here we have a skeletal muscle that we want to contract. And I guess the first thing I want to ask here is, where do these commands come from? Where in the brain do these commands come from to contract skeletal muscles out of these choices here? And hopefully you guys can pick this out. They're going to come from the cerebrum, because cerebrum is where consciousness comes from. Specifically though, which lobe of the cerebrum is it going to come from? And the answer to that is up here in the frontal lobe. So we're going to have commands that come from the frontal lobe, and they're going to travel down the central nervous system, okay, via interneurons, and then those interneurons are going to synapse with motor neurons that are part of the somatic nervous system, and those are going to travel from the spinal cord out, and they're going to go out and reach the skeletal muscles that they're going to innervate, and they're going to electrically stimulate them, and that's going to cause them to contract. Okay, so let's get a little more specific about this. Here we have the frontal lobe, and specifically within the frontal lobe, the area where these skeletal muscle commands are going to come from is the primary motor cortex. And this band of tissue right there is the primary motor cortex. And that's where skeletal muscle commands are actually going to originate from. And if we were to take a look at the primary motor cortex, first of all, the primary motor cortex is up there in the cerebral cortex. So here we're up here in the cerebral cortex. And I guess first to orient ourselves, this is what we're looking at here. This is anterior, this is posterior, and this little band of tissue right there is the primary motor cortex. And what we're looking at is just half of that. Okay? And so specifically, this is all the frontal lobe, but the part of the frontal lobe we're concerned with is the outer cerebral cortex area, this primary motor cortex. And up here in the primary motor cortex, we have what's called a motor homunculus. This is a physical representation of skeletal muscle control of the human body located within the brain. Okay, and this is similar to something we've seen before right here in this back piece of tissue called the primary sensory cortex, where we had the sensory homunculus. Well, now we have the motor homunculus. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Well, first, as you can see, there's different areas of the body that are represented on different areas of the cerebral cortex here. And different areas of the body take up more space. Okay, and we'll get to that in just a second. But first of all, what would happen if you had the brain open and you had the primary motor cortex exposed if you electrically stimulated this area of the brain right there? You took an electrode and electrically stimulated that area of the brain. Well, you'd get skeletal muscle contraction in that part of your hand. What about if you stimulated that area right there? Well, you'd get skeletal muscle contraction in part of your face. Now, why is it, though, that some areas of the body, like the face and the hands, take up all of this space in the primary motor cortex here, where other areas, like the entire leg, I guess you could say, take up just a small portion here? What's different with regards to skeletal muscles in the face and the hands than in the hip, in the torso, in the leg, in all that kind of stuff, in the arm even, in the shoulder? Okay? And that has to do with how fine a skeletal muscle contraction we have. Areas that have greater representation on the motor homunculus have finer skeletal muscle contraction. Okay, and we can dive into some of those details, but it's, for now, it's just important that you know that areas with more representation have finer skeletal muscle contraction. Okay, so let's piece this together with what we talked about earlier about the brain, okay, and especially about sensory information that comes up and gets integrated. So this is the situation that we're looking at right there, where you have your hands in cold water, and that information travels out through sensory neurons, goes to the spinal cord, and gets sent up towards the brain. So that's what this is representing right here, this information going up towards the brain. And it stops in the thalamus, and the thalamus directs it to the appropriate location in the brain, which is this area right here, the primary sensory cortex. So the thalamus directs it to the specific location of the primary sensory cortex, and what part of integration happens there? That's where you become aware of it. You become aware of the stimuli, what the stimuli is, and where it's coming from on the body. After that, it goes to the association area. What happens in the association area? This is where you give meaning to it. Okay, you give meaning to it, and then the last thing you do is you make a decision about it. What do you want to do about this situation here? Okay, and let's say we want to take our hands out of the water, then they're cold. Well, how are we going to do that? That information travels over to the frontal lobe, and it first goes to this area here called the motor association area. And we're going to kind of skip over that area, but what happens at that point is that it sends it to the primary motor cortex. And this is where those commands for skeletal muscle contraction are generated. And specifically, after we generate those commands, and that information travels down these descending pathways, and it's eventually going to get to those individual skeletal muscle cells. And this is a picture of that pathway right there. This is a descending pathway. Ascending pathways carry sensory information to the brain. Descending pathways carry motor information away from the brain. So here's the skeletal muscle that we want to contract, and that command starts up here in the primary motor cortex. And let's just count the neurons that it takes to get to the skeletal muscle. So the command is generated, and that command is taken down through the brain, down through the cerebellum, the brainstem, and travels all the way down to the level of the spinal cord, all the way down to the appropriate level of the spinal cord, where it's going to synapse with the motor neuron. So that's one neuron that travels from the primary motor cortex all the way down to the appropriate level of the spinal cord. And what kind of neuron is that? That's an interneuron. Okay, we're dealing with the central nervous system here. At that point, however, that interneuron synapses with a motor neuron, and this motor neuron is part of the somatic nervous system. And how many motor neurons does it take to get to the skeletal muscle? Again, it just takes one. So in this particular case, it only took 2 neurons to get from the primary motor cortex to the skeletal muscle. In this situation on the other side here, we have one motor neuron that comes down, one interneuron that comes down. And in this case, it synapses with another little interneuron here, but then that interneuron synapses with the motor neuron. So in this case, it took 3 total neurons to get to the skeletal muscle. What's something else you notice about these pathways? We get what's called crossing over. And I want you guys to remember that when you have sensory information, we'll say coming from the right side of the body, that sensory information is processed on the left side of the brain. Okay. Well, guess what? Skeletal muscle commands, let's say you want to contract the skeletal muscle on the right side of the body. Well, those commands come from the left side of the brain. And what they do is they come down, and then at some point they cross over to the other side, which is what we call decussation. Okay, then that interneuron comes down and synapses with the appropriate motor neuron. But again, important to know that the commands come from the opposite side of the brain. Now, to be quite honest with you, I don't know a whole lot about this, but this is important to point out. The cerebellum plays an important role in carrying out these skeletal muscle contractions. And so what's going to happen is the cerebellum is going to receive inputs from the motor cortex. Here you have the primary motor cortex, and as you can see, that information, or some of that information, is taken to the cerebellum here. Okay. And what that essentially does, though, what the cerebellum is doing is it's smoothing out the skeletal muscle movements. It's coordinating the timing and execution of skeletal muscle movements and allowing for smooth, coordinated movements. Okay, so that plays an important role in this process, and I want you guys to be aware of that. And if you have problems, if you have damage to the cerebellum, then that you can see how that manifests itself. Okay, it affects the smoothness of that movement. You can have abnormal gaits, uncoordinated movements. You can misjudge distance, all these type of things. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about is something called a motor unit. And what a motor unit is, it's one motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. So just to remind you of an important point, when individual neurons come down into a skeletal muscle, ultimately they innervate individual skeletal muscle cells. Skeletal muscle cells are the level of innervation we have here. And so a motor unit consists of a motor neuron and all of the muscle cells that it innervates. So that's one motor unit here. And I have this on your coloring, and it asks you to color a motor unit. So not only do you have to color the individual motor neuron, but you have to color all of the individual skeletal muscle fibers that it innervates. Okay, that's part of the motor unit. And we have another motor unit over here, a motor neuron innervating these skeletal muscle fibers. Okay. And you can imagine, if the brain is up there, then it sends those commands via interneurons down to the level of the spinal cord, and then you have those interneurons innervating on the motor neurons here. Okay, so these are all motor neurons that we're dealing with. this is pretty much illustrating that same point. But something else I can point out here is that here you have your motor neuron come down, and these are all the muscle cells that it innervates. The location where these axon terminals hit the individual skeletal muscle cells, these are called neuromuscular junctions, and we're going to talk about how that electrical signal comes down and actually causes contraction of that skeletal muscle fiber. Another important thing to know is that we can have different size motor units. We can have small motor units, or we can have large motor units. What do small motor units, why are they small? Well, you have a motor neuron and they're innervating a relatively small number of muscle cells, in this case only 2. And then here's a large motor unit. Here's a motor neuron, and as you can see, it comes in and it innervates a whole lot more individual skeletal muscle fibers. So this makes it a large motor unit. And you have specific places in the body where you have small motor units, and specific areas of the body where you have large motor units. And I want you guys to think about some of the areas where you may have each of these, where you may have small motor units, where you may have large motor units. But something I want to point out when you think about this is that when action potentials travel down these motor neurons, when that happens, all of the muscle cells that they innervate are going to contract. So when this motor neuron fires right here, that means that all of these skeletal muscle cells are going to contract simultaneously. Okay? So where do you want large motor units? Where do you want small motor units? Okay? And we'll look at a couple situations here. What about the skeletal muscles in the hand? Look at all these skeletal muscles in the hand there. Okay. What I want you guys to think about is how these skeletal muscles are innervated. Are they innervated by large motor units or small motor units? Then I want you to think about the hip, and in particular these large butt muscles, the gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius. What kind of motor neurons do you have coming down here on these butt muscles? Are they large motor units or small motor units? Okay, and then just to kind of preview where we're going to go with all this, this gets down to the physiology here, but here we have a motor neuron coming down, and here you can see all the parts of the axon terminal innervating a skeletal muscle cell. This is an individual skeletal muscle cell, and these are individual myofibrils within that skeletal muscle cell. What we call this area is a neuromuscular junction, where the neuron meets the skeletal muscle. And we're going to talk about the physiology of this, because ultimately what needs to happen is you have an action potential that comes down and hits the axon terminal, and we want that electrical signal to be transferred to the skeletal muscle cell. We want the skeletal muscle cell to become electrically excited. Okay. And we're going to talk about the events that cause that to happen. And fortunately, you guys are familiar with all of these steps right here. We've seen it before where neurons come down and innervate other neurons. Okay. A lot of the steps are exactly the same. This is just a picture of this is a skeletal muscle cell. These are individual skeletal muscle fibers. And you can see this is a motor neuron that comes down, and you can see the axon terminal branches and forms all these neuromuscular junctions with these individual skeletal muscle cells there. This is a really interesting medically relevant video that I want you guys to watch. It's a story about this man right here, and what happened basically is he was in an electrical accident and he lost his limbs. Okay, and so now what they're doing is they're designing specific prosthetics that are going to allow them to basically control those. And I'll just give you kind of a little preview here. What happens when his arms? So here we have the brain, and we have the frontal lobe up here, and let's say we want to. Well, let's just follow the pathway of a neuron that's going to go to the left arm here. It'd start over in the left or in the right primary motor cortex. It'd come down the spinal cord to the cervical level, and it would cross over, and then at that point it would hit a motor neuron, and that motor neuron would travel out like so, and it would innervate the specific skeletal muscle fibers that it would in the arm. But since his arms were amputated, it broke that spinal nerve. And so what these prosthetics are doing, though, is that they're essentially reconnecting those spinal nerve connections with different areas of the prosthetic. And essentially what he's able to do with practice is generate commands from the primary motor cortex, generate commands going through these spinal nerves, and that's allowing him to control this prosthetic right here. And then here's a couple other things that they're doing. Basically, well, this one is actually along a different line here, but different things that they're doing to reconnect essentially the primary motor cortex with skeletal muscle movement.